When Mary Ellen turned 18, she didn't expect her birthday to come with a price tag. The daughter of a poor farmer in the dusty outskirts of Montana, she had spent her entire life milking cows, stitching torn clothes, and praying for a better tomorrow. But when drought hit and her father's debts piled high, tomorrow came in the form of a widowed rancher named Luke Barrett, a man twice her age, with 3 motherless children and a grief so deep it shadowed his eyes. He came to her family's worn-out cabin one evening, hat in hand, and a bag of money her father didn't even try to refuse. And just like that, Mary Ellen's fate was sealed, not with love, but with desperation. The wedding was quiet, held under a sky streaked with orange and gold. Luke didn't smile once. He stood tall and solemn, his dark hair peppered with gray, his hands rough as the land he worked. Mary Ellen trembled as the preacher said the vows, her voice barely more than a whisper. When Luke lifted her veil, his expression softened for the briefest second, then vanished behind that stoic mask again. That night, as the wagon rattled toward his ranch, Mary Ellen stared into the endless plains, her heart pounding with fear and uncertainty. She had never even been kissed, and now she belonged to a stranger who barely spoke to her. The Barrett ranch stretched for miles, a lonely sprawl of barns, fences, and grazing fields. The moment she stepped off the wagon, 3 pairs of curious eyes peered at her from the porch. The children, James, the oldest at 12, Annie, a quiet girl of 9, and little Tommy, barely 5, watched her with a mix of confusion and suspicion. Their mother had died 3 winters ago, and Mary Ellen could feel their resentment before a word was spoken. Luke introduced her curtly. "This is Mary, she'll be living with us now." Then he turned away to tend to the horses. The house was simple but cold, full of shadows and silence. Mary Ellen tried to smile, tried to make herself useful. She cooked, cleaned, and even mended the children's torn clothes. But the air between them stayed tense. James refused to eat her cooking, Annie avoided her eyes, and Tommy hid behind the rocking chair whenever she came near. She cried herself to sleep that first week, curled under a quilt that smelled faintly of another woman's perfume. Luke slept in the barn most nights claiming work, but Mary Ellen knew it was grief. Or perhaps guilt. Days turned into weeks, and Mary Ellen began to notice things. Luke wasn't cruel, just distant. He worked from sunrise to sunset, his broad shoulders bent under more than just the weight of the land. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he'd stand by his late wife's grave, hat in hand, lips moving in silent prayer. Mary Ellen's heart softened a little each time she saw it. She began to help more around the ranch, feeding the horses, tending the garden, reading stories to the children even when they pretended not to listen. Slowly, things began to change. One evening, a storm rolled over the valley. The wind howled and rain lashed against the windows, shaking the little house. Luke was out in the field securing the livestock, and Mary Ellen, worried sick, grabbed a lantern and ran out into the darkness. Mud splashed up her skirt, thunder roared overhead, and lightning split the sky. She found him struggling to pull a frightened horse free from a broken fence. Without hesitation, she threw down the lantern and helped, her small hands trembling but determined. When the horse finally broke loose, Luke turned to her, drenched and breathless. For the first time, his eyes met hers with something other than indifference. "You shouldn't have come out here," he said, voice rough but not unkind. "I couldn't just stay inside while you were out here alone," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging around them. Something changed that night. When they returned to the house, soaked to the bone, Luke handed her his coat, his fingers brushing hers. It was a small gesture, but to Mary Ellen, it felt like the first spark of warmth in a cold, endless winter. The children saw it too, the way their father's eyes lingered on her now, the way her laughter began to fill the quiet spaces their mother once had. Annie was the first to open up, slipping her a handmade bracelet the next morning. "Mama used to wear blue," the little girl said shyly. "It looks good on you." From that day on, the walls began to crumble. James helped her fix the chicken coop. Tommy followed her around the garden, giggling as he tried to catch butterflies. Luke started eating dinner with them again, even joining in on small conversations. There was still pain in his eyes, but it no longer ruled him. One night, as they sat by the fireplace, Mary Ellen began to hum an old hymn. Luke closed his eyes, listening quietly. When she stopped, he said softly, "You've got a voice that could calm the worst storm." She blushed, her heart fluttering. Winter came hard that year, blanketing the ranch in snow. Supplies ran low, and Luke fell ill with fever. Mary Ellen stayed by his side for days, refusing to rest. She cooked broth, wiped his forehead, and whispered prayers into the cold air. The children clung to her, terrified they'd lose another parent. But she wouldn't let that happen. When he finally woke, weak but alive, his hand found hers. "You saved me," he said hoarsely. She smiled through tears. "No, Luke, you saved me first." By spring, the ranch was alive again. The laughter of children, the scent of fresh bread, the sound of Luke's boots on the porch, all of it wove together into something like home. One afternoon, as she hung laundry beneath a bright blue sky, Luke approached her holding a small carved box. Inside was a simple silver ring. "You were given to me, Mary," he said quietly, "but I'd rather earn your heart. Will you let me try?" Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. The rancher who once saw her as an obligation now looked at her like a miracle. Word spread through the valley about Luke Barrett and his young bride, the girl who came with fear in her eyes and turned a grieving house into a home again. Even her father, guilt heavy on his shoulders, rode out to see her one day. When he found her smiling, surrounded by children who called her Mama, his eyes filled with tears. "You forgive me, child?" he asked. Mary Ellen took his rough hands and said, "You did what you thought was right." But God knew better. Years later, when people spoke of the Barrett Ranch, they didn't talk about tragedy anymore. They talked about love, quiet, steadfast, and healing. The kind that grows from ashes and drought. The kind that doesn't just survive hardship, but blossoms because of it. Mary Ellen had been given away at 18, still a virgin to a man she didn't know. But what happened afterward, the laughter, the storms, the healing, shocked everyone. Because what began as a transaction turned into a testament. That love, no matter how unlikely, finds a way to bloom even in the hardest soil. And as the sun set behind the Montana hills, Mary Ellen stood on the porch, watching Luke and the children in the field. She smiled, her heart full. For the first time in her life, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning sun spilled across the Montana hills like golden honey, painting the land that once felt so foreign to Mary Ellen in warm, forgiving light. Years had passed since she first arrived at the Barrett Ranch as a frightened 18-year-old girl. The woman she was now could hardly recognize that trembling bride who had climbed out of Luke's wagon with uncertainty in her heart. She had found her strength here in the soil, in the faces of 3 children who now called her Mama, and in the steady love of the man who once could barely look her in the eye. But life on the ranch, like the weather, was never predictable. Just when peace felt secure, life had a way of testing it. That summer, drought struck again. The grass grew brittle, and the river that fed their cattle shrank into a thin, reluctant stream. Luke worked day and night, but the worry etched deep lines across his brow. Mary Ellen tried to hide her concern, keeping the house warm with laughter and song. She knew what fear could do to a man's pride, especially one who had lost before. But when the sky refused to rain, the weight grew heavier each day. One evening, after putting Tommy to bed, she found Luke sitting on the porch, staring at the darkening horizon. His hands were clasped together, and the weariness in his eyes made her chest ache. She sat beside him, her hand finding his. "We'll get through it," she whispered. "We always do." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You shouldn't have to keep saying that, Mary. You've done enough holding this place together. Maybe it's time I admit, I can't keep it all afloat." She looked at him, her voice steady. "Luke Barrett, you listen to me. You've faced worse storms than this one. You lost your wife, raised 3 children alone, and still kept this land alive. If anyone can fight through a drought, it's you." His eyes softened as he turned toward her. "I don't deserve you, Mary." She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe not, but you've got me anyway." That night, as they lay in bed, the sound of dry wind brushing against the window, Luke pulled her close for the first time, not just as a husband, but as a man deeply in love. "You saved this family," he whispered against her hair. "And maybe you saved me too." Weeks went by and the family did what they always did. Endured. The children grew taller, stronger. James, now 17, had become his father's right hand, working sunup to sundown beside Luke in the fields. Annie had turned into a graceful young woman, with Mary Ellen's gentle heart and her mother's blue eyes. Tommy, 10 years old and mischievous as ever, followed them everywhere, dreaming of one day owning a horse of his own. Then came the letter. It arrived one dusty afternoon. carried by a mail rider who looked half dead from the heat. Luke opened it at the kitchen table, his brow furrowing as he read. Mary Ellen watched his face, her heart skipping. "What is it?" she asked. He set the